A potential bombshell from Venezuela. President Nicolás Maduro has reportedly offered to step down, a sign that he's feeling the increasing pressure. That revelation comes as President Trump authorizes CIA covert action planning. So, is this the beginning of the end for Maduro's regime, or just a stalling tactic for the strongman? I'll have the details. We're starting today with a striking development, if true, out of Venezuela, one that tells us a lot about where this situation may be heading. The story comes straight from new reporting by the New York Times, which spoke with multiple officials who've been briefed on the internal discussions. It gives us the best window yet into what's happening behind the scenes. Now, President Trump has reportedly authorized the CIA to begin planning covert operations inside Venezuela, and at the very same time, we're learning that Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro has reportedly, privately, floated the possibility of stepping down. So, let's take a closer look, shall we? First, the CIA authorization. According to the Times, President Trump has given the agency the green light to prepare covert action options against the Maduro regime. Now, we should be clear about what this means and what it doesn't. This is planning authority, not operational authority. It doesn't mean the CIA is about to deploy teams on the ground tomorrow. But it does mean that the agency is being told, get ready, build the options, present those options, know what we can do if the president decides to move forward. And that's significant because it lines up with what we've been watching for weeks. You've heard me talk about the U.S. military posture in the Caribbean, including naval assets repositioning closer to Venezuela. Now, we don't need to list every ship or platform here, but we've been tracking that buildup closely, and it's part of a much larger pressure campaign. Which brings us to the second part of this story. Nicolás Maduro, the authoritarian leader, of course, who once vowed he'd never leave the presidency under any circumstances, has reportedly privately suggested he might be willing to step down. According to the Times, intermediaries working between Washington and Caracas have relayed conversations in which Maduro indicated he could be open to leaving office under certain conditions and after a period of time. Now, U.S. officials aren't sure whether this is genuine or just a stalling tactic. It could be Maduro trying to buy time, trying to divide Washington, or trying to negotiate guarantees for himself and possibly his inner circle. But even if this offer isn't fully sincere, the fact that it was made at all is telling. Authoritarian leaders don't typically float exit strategies unless they're feeling real pressure, either from outside forces or from their own collapsing economy or from the people around them who see the writing on the wall. And Maduro is, frankly, facing all of that. Venezuela's economy has been in free fall for years. Inflation is out of control. The country's oil revenues, basically its lifeblood, have collapsed. Food shortages continue, and with the U.S. military reinforcing its posture in the region, Maduro may be looking for a way that doesn't end with him being dead or in prison. Now, let's talk about the U.S. side of this. Inside the Trump administration, there appear to be debates over how far to push. Some advisors have been advocating a harder line, saying the U.S. should seize this opportunity to force a political transition. Now, mind you, the folks supposedly pushing for that harder line have probably never been at the pointy edge of the spear. Washington is chock full of people willing to sign off on a conflict and who themselves couldn't identify the business end of a weapon. Others, at the same time, reportedly are warning that Venezuela's internal decay and messy politics could drag America into a long, complex commitment. Authorizing CIA planning is basically a middle step. It's a way for a president to say, I want options on the table. I want to know what we can do, and I want preparation underway in case events move faster than expected. The CIA, for its part, specializes in these types of contingency plans, intelligence operations, covert pressure campaigns, support to opposition networks, information operations, and other tools that fall short of open military conflict. They're designed to shape events quietly, especially in places where the U.S. doesn't necessarily want to deploy military force. So, what happens now? Well, it's a fine question. A lot depends on whether Maduro's supposed offer is real. Is he testing the waters? Is he trying to gauge how Washington would respond? Is he attempting to negotiate immunity or safe passage for himself, his family, and members of his regime? Another factor is the Venezuelan military. If they believe that Maduro is a liability or that his departure is necessary to avoid a confrontation with the U.S., well, they could become the decisive force behind the scenes. In past Latin American transitions, it's typically the military that ultimately determines whether a leader stays or goes. We're also watching for signs that U.S. covert planning is shifting from abstract to actionable. That could include more pressure on Maduro's financial networks, more coordination with regional partners, and closer monitoring of Venezuela's security services. Of course, there's also one more possibility here, that this is part of a U.S. information campaign. Publicly revealing that Maduro floated an exit strategy could be a signal aimed at Maduro's military leadership, suggesting that the big guy is thinking about packing his bags. All right, coming up next, Warsaw blames Russia for rail sabotage. And MI5 says the Chinese spies are using a major social platform to approach members of parliament. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here. Well, Thanksgiving is just around the corner. And one of the great things about Thanksgiving is that it's one of the few times in the year when we can all slow down, gather as families, and remind ourselves of what we're thankful for. Personally, I'm thankful for family and friends and excellent pecan pie. The holiday, though, is about gratitude, not just for the past, but for the future. And the terrific folks at Tri-Tails Premium Beef, they understand that. You got to check them out. They're a fifth-generation ranching family in Texas, raising cattle the right way and shipping great-tasting beef right to your door. And just in time for Thanksgiving, they've created the Thankful Box. It's a great selection to help you create the sort of comforting meals that bring family and friends together. And it's more than a holiday meal. It's a way to create delicious memories. And let's be honest, nobody's going to be upset if there's a little less turkey on the Thanksgiving table and a little more beef. Find it now at trybeef.com/PDB. Again, that's trybeef.com/PDB. Welcome back to the PDB. I want to provide an update on the situation in Poland. After days of treating a weekend rail line attack as a mystery with suspected ties to Russia, Warsaw now says that it has identified the saboteurs and their handlers, confirming the attack as a Kremlin-orchestrated strike on a rail artery that keeps Ukraine's war efforts supplied. To recap, a section of track on the Warsaw-Lublin corridor, one of the most critical routes feeding Ukraine, had been damaged by what investigators identified as military-grade explosives. And then came the other clues. Metal objects deliberately placed on the rails near Puławy, and power lines sliced up in ways that didn't resemble any accident. As Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk put it, those objects, that sabotage, was, quote, likely intended to derail a train. But no injuries were reported and no derailment occurred. The line from Warsaw toward the Ukrainian border is one of the main arteries for Western aid into a country fighting off a Russian invasion. Everything from humanitarian supplies to equipment destined for the front lines. Authorities shut down the affected segment, brought in territorial defense units, and began sweeping roughly 120 kilometers of track for additional devices or signs of sabotage. Now, the picture is sharper and more unsettling. Speaking to lawmakers, Tusk said investigators identified 2 Ukrainian citizens as suspects behind the explosion. According to the Prime Minister, the pair had been collaborating for a long time with Russian secret services and were allegedly commissioned by those services to carry out the blast before then fleeing to Belarus, which is firmly, of course, in Moscow's orbit. One of the men, Tusk confirmed, had been previously convicted of, quote, acts of sabotage by a court in western Ukraine. Makes you wonder why he was roaming free. The other is a resident of the Russian-occupied Donbass region. As of now, their names haven't been released, but the message from Warsaw is loud and clear. This wasn't a lone wolf or a rogue criminal crew. It was, in Poland's view, a Russian operation carried out using Ukrainian nationals as cutouts, which is textbook hybrid warfare tradecraft designed to mask responsibility as they targeted a supply line critical to Kyiv's defenses. The response inside Poland shows just how seriously Warsaw views the threat. Top military and intelligence officials convened Tuesday as Tusk formally declared the explosion an act of sabotage. He told Parliament the country would raise the threat level to Charlie, the third highest rung on Poland's 4-tier scale, along specific rail routes, while the rest of the country stays at level 2. Tusk called the situation, quote, perhaps the most serious national security situation in Poland since the outbreak of the full-scale war in Ukraine. For a government that casts itself as Ukraine's rear base, the idea that Russia is now moving from threats to physical sabotage on Polish soil, well, that lands hard. And right on cue, the denials, of course, rolled in from Moscow. A Russian diplomatic official in Warsaw dismissed Poland's accusations as, quote, absurd statements meant to, quote, stoke Russophobia and war hysteria, end quote. Well, I'd say Putin's invasion of Ukraine was probably all they needed to stoke that Russophobia. The Kremlin insisted it is, quote, far more important tasks than sabotaging Polish rail lines. Well, I suppose like keeping the Russian people from going into a full-scale revolt over Putin's destruction of the Russian economy, or maybe the million-plus casualties that he's responsible for. And Putin's mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, cast Warsaw's reaction as yet another example of NATO bent on destroying relations with Russia. But Warsaw's own military leadership isn't buying any of the Russian comments, and they're saying so publicly. The chief of the General Staff of the Polish Armed Forces warned that Russia, quote, has begun the long period of preparing for war with Poland, building the conditions for potential aggression long before any open confrontation. In his words, Poland isn't experiencing, quote, an actual war, but a pre-war situation, the classic pattern of hybrid pressure meant to probe defenses and test responses. Against that backdrop, Warsaw is also tightening the screws diplomatically. Poland's foreign minister announced that Warsaw will withdraw consent for Russia's last operating consulate in the country, directly tying the move to the sabotage incidents. Moscow vowed to retaliate by reducing Poland's diplomatic presence in Russia, another essentially tit-for-tat in a relationship now stripped down to its barest essentials. Okay, shifting focus to the United Kingdom. London is warning that China has been using LinkedIn headhunters and covert operatives to scope out Parliament and try to reel in people with access to sensitive government work. The alert from MI5 came with a sense of déjà vu in Westminster. 2 months ago, the government was forced to explain why an espionage case involving a parliamentary researcher and a schoolteacher collapsed, a moment that left lawmakers wondering how close Beijing had already come to slipping inside the system. That case centered on the researcher Christopher Cash and teacher Christopher Berry, both of whom were arrested last year on suspicion of funneling sensitive information to the Chinese Communist Party. They were never charged under the Official Secrets Act because the UK government never formally labeled Beijing a threat. This week's warning suggests those lessons may have come late. Security Minister Dan Jarvis told MPs that China's Ministry of State Security, the MSS, hadn't slowed its efforts at all. Well, of course not. He noted that the MSS, quote, has been busy attempting to recruit and cultivate individuals with access to sensitive information about Parliament and the UK government, end quote. Often, of course, behind the friendly facade of LinkedIn job offers or freelance consultancy work. Jarvis described the campaign as, quote, a covert and calculated attempt by a foreign power to interfere with our sovereign affairs, and vowed that Britain would take all necessary measures to defend its national interest. According to MI5, the operation leaned on one Amanda Chiu, who is the chief executive of a Beijing firm, and Shirley Shen of Hong Kong's Internship Union, both described as, quote, civilian recruitment headhunters working as cutouts for CCP intelligence. Their job, London's top security agency said, is to make the first approach, a message on LinkedIn, a seemingly legitimate recruitment inquiry for what seems like a harmless request for a geopolitical report, classic tradecraft. From there, targets are quietly handed off to the CCP's Ministry of State Security officers, with both fake and legitimate companies used as cover. MI5 stressed that what could seem like even minor insights can be stitched into Beijing's wider intelligence effort. The warning is already stirring up the political fallout from that previously collapsed espionage case. Critics of Prime Minister Keir Starmer argued that prosecutors were hamstrung by the government's reluctance at the time to formally designate China a threat, a decision that they say reflected an eagerness to preserve smooth trade relations with Beijing. Now, with MI5 laying out how aggressively CCP operatives have been probing Parliament, the question of whether the government misjudged the risk is back on the table. Well, it's not really a question, is it? Of course they misjudged the risk. And as you can predict, Beijing has rejected London's allegations. There, is a surprise. In a statement posted to the Chinese embassy's website, officials called the claims, quote, pure fabrication and malicious slander, and said that they had lodged formal objections with the UK government. Well, good job. Well done, you. Now, I'd like to point out that Jarvis didn't disclose how successful Chinese operatives may have been, but he made clear the response will be robust. Britain is expected to spend roughly $230 million upgrading Parliament and the government's computer systems, bolstering election security, and expanding cooperation with advanced technology firms for security purposes. MPs are also expected to meet with university leaders to help shield academic institutions from Beijing's attempts to quietly influence research agendas and course content. Another front, Jarvis suggested, where the CCP has sought to exploit the openness of British institutions. All right, coming up in the back of the brief. Despite strained relations, the U.S. and Russia are discussing a new prisoner swap. That's according to our Russian envoy. I'll have those details when we come back. Hey, Mike Baker here with big news from our friends over at Birch Gold Group. Now, it's that one time of year when Birch Gold Group gives away free gold with every qualifying purchase. You heard me right. For Black Friday, when you convert an existing IRA or a 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold, Birch Gold will send you free gold to your home for every $20,000 purchased. Look, gold started this year around, $2,600 an ounce? And by October, it was over $4,000 an ounce. And why? Well, I'm glad you asked. Mostly because of global uncertainty. Look, 2025 has been defined by trade wars and real wars and general unease. And central banks are pulling away from the U.S. dollar as the global reserve currency. And, as you may know, gold thrives in times of uncertainty like these. So, if you're looking to diversify your savings, Birch Gold can help you. Plus, now through November 30th, get free gold with a qualifying purchase. Just text PDB to 989-898 to claim your eligibility and for a free information kit on gold. But your opportunity for free gold with purchase ends on November 30th, so don't wait. Text PDB to the number 989-898 for all the details. In today's back of the brief, Washington and Moscow are quietly testing the waters for another prisoner exchange, signaling a rare moment of diplomatic cooperation. According to a new report from Axios, U.S. and Russian officials have begun exploratory talks on a potential swap, discussions that got underway late last month when one of Putin's senior envoys traveled to the U.S. Kirill Dmitriev, the head of Russia's sovereign wealth fund and a longtime Putin confidant, told Axios that he held meetings in Washington from October 24th to the 26th, during which the two sides discussed the status of American prisoners in Russia. Dmitriev described the talks, which involved U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and other administration officials, as, quote, constructive, though he emphasized that no agreement has been reached. U.S. officials confirmed those conversations, but also stressed that no deal is imminent. Privately, the administration has been searching for leverage to secure the release of at least 8 American citizens still detained in Russia, a list that includes teachers, a musician, a U.S. Army soldier, and dual nationals arrested on what the State Department calls politically motivated charges. As our longtime listeners will likely recall, back in February, the Trump administration secured the release of Mark Fogel, an American teacher detained in Russia for 3.5 years. And in April, the White House negotiated the release of Ksenia Karelina, a dual citizen and former ballet dancer who was arrested while visiting family in Russia in January of 2024. Shortly after her release, the administration sent Moscow a roster of 9 additional names for a potential return. And in May, President Trump and Putin reportedly discussed an exchange that would see them all freed. Russia, for its part, has also been pressing Washington to release several of its own nationals, including individuals convicted in U.S. courts on espionage and sanctions evasion charges. But I should stress that the renewed talks of a swap come at an incredibly delicate moment in U.S.-Russia relations. The war in Ukraine continues with no end in sight, and as we've been closely tracking, Washington has intensified sanctions against Russia's oil and financial sectors in recent weeks. Yet history shows that even during periods of extreme tension, prisoner exchanges have acted as one of the few remaining channels of diplomacy between the two countries. Still, it appears both sides are approaching the negotiations with caution. Any exchange involving high-profile detainees risks triggering domestic backlash, in Russia for giving up leverage, and in the U.S. for appearing to reward a hostile power that continues to imprison Americans for geopolitical leverage and bargaining purposes. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Thursday, the 20th of November. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And as a public service announcement, remember to check out and subscribe to our action-packed YouTube channel. Just stop on by YouTube and find at President's Daily Brief. It's informative and entertaining, and it won't give you that gassy, bloated feeling like some of those other YouTube channels. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool. Hey, Mike Baker here, PDB host and, of course, personal hygiene specialist. Now, I suspect a lot of you deal with long days and hard work and high-pressure jobs. And you know what that can mean, right? Sweat and body odor. I told you I was going to talk about personal hygiene. But let me give you a solid pro tip on combating that sweat and odor. We're talking Mando deodorant. Problem solved. Mando was created by a doctor. It's safe everywhere, all your bits and pieces, and clinically proven to block odor all day up to, get this, 72 hours. It's paraben-free, baking soda-free, and it's got scents like Pro Sport, subtle and effective. What I think is the best part of it? Well, it's reliable freshness without any weird deodorant residue. You know what I'm talking about. Sweat control, no awkward stains. Check out Mando and get your starter pack. Stick and cream, free wipes and wash, and free shipping. Come on, no fuss, no muss. Use code PDB at shopmando.com for 20% off site-wide, plus free shipping. Shopmando.com. Code PDB.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.